Section 21 of The Minister's Wooing. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Minister's Wooing by Harriet Beecher Stowe. Chapter 18. The doctor sat at his study table. It was evening, and the slant beams of the setting sun shot their golden arrows through the healthy purple clusters of lilacs that veiled the windows. There had been a shower that filled them with drops of rain, which every now and then tattooed with a slender rat-tat on the window-sill, as a breeze would shake the leaves and bear in perfume on its wings. Sweet, fragrance-laden airs tripped stirringly to and fro about the study table, making gentle confusions, fluttering papers on moral ability, agitating treatises on the great end of creation, mixing up subtle distinctions between amiable instincts and true holiness, and, in short, conducting themselves like very unappreciative and unphilosophical little breezes. The doctor patiently smoothed back and rearranged, while opposite to him sat Mary, bending over some copying she was doing for him. One stray sunbeam fell on her light brown hair, tinging it to gold. Her long drooping lashes lay over the wax-like pink of her cheeks as she wrote on. "Mary," said the doctor, pushing the papers from him. "Sir," she answered, looking up, the blood just perceptibly rising in her cheeks. "Do you ever have any periods in which your evidences seem not altogether clear?" Nothing could show more forcibly the grave, earnest character of thought in New England at this time than the fact that this use of the term evidences had become universally significant and understood as relating to one's right of citizenship in a celestial, invisible commonwealth. So Mary understood it, and it was with a deepened flush she answered gently, "No, sir." "What? Never any doubts?" said the doctor. "I am sorry," said Mary apologetically, "but I do not see how I can have. I never could." "Ah," said the doctor musingly, "would I could say so. There are times, indeed, when I hope I have an interest in the precious Redeemer, and behold an infinite loveliness and beauty in him, apart from anything I expect or hope. But even then, how deceitful is the human heart! How insensibly might a mere selfish love take the place of that disinterested complacency which regards him for what he is in himself, apart from what he is to us. Say, my dear friend, does not this thought sometimes make you tremble?" Poor Mary was truth itself, and this question distressed her. She must answer the truth. The fact was that it had never come into her blessed little heart to tremble, for she was one of those children of the bride chamber who cannot mourn, because the bridegroom is ever with them. But then, when she saw the man for whom her reverence was almost like that for her God, thus distrustful, thus lowly, she could not but feel that her too calm repose might after all be the shallow, treacherous calm of an ignorant, ill-grounded spirit, and therefore, with a deep blush and a faltering voice, she said, "Indeed, I am afraid something must be wrong with me. I cannot have any fears. I never could. I try sometimes, but the thought of God's goodness comes all around me, and I am so happy before I think of it." "Such exercises, my dear friend, I have also had," said the doctor, "but before I rest on them as evidences, I feel constrained to make the following inquiries. Is this gratitude that swells my bosom the result of a mere natural sensibility? Does it arise in a particular manner because God has done me good? Or do I love God for what he is, as well as for what he has done, and for what he has done for others, as well as for what he has done for me? Love to God, which is built on nothing but good received, is not incompatible with a disposition so horrid as even to curse God to his face. If God is not to be loved except when he does good, then in affliction we are free. If doing us good is all that renders God lovely to us, then not doing us good divests him of his glory, and dispenses us from obligation to love him. but there must be undoubtedly some permanent reason why God is to be loved by all, and if not doing us good divests him of his glory so as to free us from our obligation to love, it equally frees the universe, so that in fact the universe of happiness, if ours be not included, reflects no glory on its author. The doctor had practiced his subtle mental analysis till his instruments were so fine-pointed and keen-edged that he scarce ever allowed a flower of sacred emotion to spring in his soul without picking it to pieces to see if its genera and species were correct. Love, gratitude, reverence, benevolence, which all moved in mighty tides in his soul, were all compelled to pause midway while he rubbed up his optical instruments to see whether they were rising in right order. Mary, on the contrary, had the blessed gift of womanhood, that vivid life in the soul and sentiment which resists the chills of analysis, as a healthful human heart resists cold. Yet still, all humbly, she thought this perhaps was a defect in herself, and therefore, having confessed in a depreciating tone her habits of unanalyzed faith and love, she added, "But, my dear sir, you are my best friend. I trust you will be faithful to me. If I am deceiving myself, undeceive me. You cannot be too severe with me." "Alas," said the doctor, "I fear that I may be only a blind leader of the blind. What, after all, if I be only a miserable self-deceiver? What if some thought of self has come in to poison all my prayers and strivings? It is true, I think. Yes, I think," said the doctor, speaking very slowly and with intense earnestness, "I think that if I knew at this moment that my name never would be written among those of the elect, I could still see God to be infinitely amiable and glorious, and could feel sure that he could not do me wrong, and that it was infinitely becoming and right that he should dispose of me according to his sovereign pleasure. I think so, but still my deceitful heart, after all, I might find it rising in rebellion. Say, my dear friend, are you sure that, should you discover yourself to be forever condemned by his justice, you would not find your heart rising up against him?" "Against him?" said Mary, with a tremulous, sorrowful expression on her face. "Against my heavenly Father?" Her face flushed and faded, her eyes kindled eagerly, as if she had something to say, and then grew misty with tears. At last she said, "Thank you, my dear faithful friend. I will think about this. Perhaps I may have been deceived. How very difficult it must be to know one's self perfectly." Mary went into her own little room and sat leaning for a long time with her elbow on the window seat, watching the pale shells of the apple blossoms as they sailed and fluttered downward into the grass, and listened to a chippering conversation in which the birds in the nest above were settling up their small housekeeping accounts for the day. After a while she took her pen and wrote the following, which the doctor found the next morning lying on his study table: "My dear, honored friend, how can I sufficiently thank you for your faithfulness with me? All you say to me seems true and excellent, and yet, my dear sir, permit me to try to express to you some of the many thoughts to which our conversation this evening has given rise. To love God because he is good to me, you seem to think is not a right kind of love, and yet every moment of my life I have experienced his goodness. When recollection brings back the past, where can I look that I see not his goodness? What moment of my life presents not instances of merciful kindness to me, as well as to every creature, more and greater than I can express, than my mind is able to take in? How, then, can I help loving God because he is good to me? Were I not an object of God's mercy and goodness, I cannot have any conception what would be my feeling. Imagination never yet placed me in a situation not to experience the goodness of God in some way or other, and if I do love him, how can it be but because he is good, and to me good? Do not God's children love him because he first loved them? If I called nothing goodness which did not happen to suit my inclination, and could not believe the Deity to be gracious and merciful, except when the course of events was so ordered as to agree with my humour, so far from imagining that I had any love to God, I must conclude myself wholly destitute of anything good. A love founded on nothing but good received is not, you say, incompatible with a disposition so horrid as even to curse God. I am not sensible that I ever in my life imagined anything but good could come from the hand of God. From a being infinite in goodness, everything must be good, though we do not always comprehend how it is so. Are not afflictions good? Does he not even in judgment remember mercy? Sensible that afflictions are but blessings in disguise, I would bless the hand that, with infinite kindness, wounds only to heal, and love and adore the goodness of God equally in suffering as in rejoicing. The disinterested love to God, which you think is alone the genuine love, I see not how we can be certain we possess, when our love of happiness and our love of God are so inseparably connected. The joys arising from a consciousness that God is a benefactor to me and my friends, and when I think of God, every creature is my friend, if arising from a selfish motive, it does not seem to me possible could be changed into hate, even supposing God my enemy, whilst I regarded him as a being infinitely just as well as good. If God is my enemy, it must be because I deserve he should be such, and it does not seem to me possible that I should hate him, even if I knew he would always be so. In what you say of willingness to suffer eternal punishment, I don't know that I understand what the feeling is. Is it wickedness in me that I do not feel a willingness to be left to eternal sin? Can anyone joyfully acquiesce in being thus left? When I pray for a new heart and a right spirit, must I be willing to be denied and rejoice that my prayer is not heard? Could any real Christian rejoice in this? But he fears it not. He knows it will never be. He therefore can cheerfully leave it with God, and so can I. Such, my dear friend, are my thoughts, poor and unworthy, yet they seem to me as certain as my life, or as anything I see. Am I unduly confident? I ask your prayers, that I may be guided aright. Your affectionate friend, Mary. There are in this world two kinds of natures, those that have wings and those that have feet, the winged and the walking spirits. The walking are the logicians, the winged are the instinctive and poetic. Natures that must always walk find many a bog, many a thicket, many a tangled brake, which God's happy little winged birds flit over by one noiseless flight. Nay, when a man has toiled till his feet weigh too heavily with the mud of earth to enable him to walk another step, these little birds will often cleave the air in a right line towards the bosom of God, and show the way where he could never have found it. The doctor paused in his ponderous and heavy reasonings to read this real woman's letter, and being a loving man, he felt as if he could have kissed the hem of her garment who wrote it. He recorded it in his journal, and after it this significant passage from the Canticles: I charge you, O ye daughters of Jerusalem, by the roes and by the hinds of the field, that ye stir not up nor awake this lovely one till she please. Mrs. Scudder's motherly eye noticed with satisfaction these quiet communings. Let it alone, she said to herself. Before she knows it, she will find herself wholly under his influence. Mrs. Scudder was a wise woman. End of section 21. Section 22 of The Minister's Wooing. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Minister's Wooing by Harriet Beecher Stowe. Chapter 19. In the course of a day or two a handsome carriage drew up in front of Mrs. Scudder's cottage, and a brilliant party alighted. They were Colonel and Madame de Frontignac, the Abbé Lafont, and Colonel Burr. Mrs. Scudder and her daughter, being prepared for the call, sat in afternoon dignity and tranquillity in the best room with their knitting work. Madame de Frontignac had divined with the lightning-like tact which belongs to women in the positive, and to French women in the superlative degree, that there was something in the cottage girl, whom she had passingly seen at the party, which powerfully affected the man whom she loved with all the jealous intensity of a strong nature, and hence she embraced eagerly the opportunity to see her, yes, to see her, to study her, to dart her keen French wit through her, and detect the secret of her charm, that she too might practise it. Madame de Frontignac was one of those women whose beauty is so striking and imposing that they seem to kindle up, even in the most prosaic apartment, an atmosphere of enchantment. All the pomp and splendor of high life, the wit, the refinements, the nameless graces and luxuries of courts, seemed to breathe in invisible airs around her, and she made a Faubourg Saint-Germain of the darkest room into which she entered. Mary thought, when she came in, that she had never seen anything so splendid. She was dressed in a black velvet riding habit, buttoned to the throat with coral. Her riding hat drooped with its long plume so as to cast a shadow over her animated face, out of which her dark eyes shone like jewels, and her pomegranate cheeks glowed with the rich shaded radiance of one of Rembrandt's pictures. Something quaint and foreign, something poetic and strange, marked each turn of her figure, each article of her dress, down to the sculptured hand on which glittered singular and costly rings, and the riding glove embroidered with seed pearls that fell carelessly beside her on the floor. In Antwerp one sees a picture in which Rubens, who felt more than any other artist the glory of the physical life, has embodied his conception of the Madonna in opposition to the faded, cold ideals of the Middle Ages, from which he revolted with such a bound. His Mary is a superb oriental sultana, with lustrous dark eyes, redundant form, jewelled turban, standing leaning on the balustrade of a princely terrace, and bearing on her hand not the silver dove, but a gorgeous paroquet. The two styles in this instance were both in the same room, and as Burr sat looking from one to the other, he felt for a moment as one would who should put a sketch of Overbeck's beside a splendid painting of Titian's. For a few moments everything in the room seemed faded and cold in contrast with the tropical atmosphere of this regal beauty. Burr watched Mary with a keen eye to see if she were dazzled and overawed. He saw nothing but the most innocent surprise and delight. All the slumbering poetry within her seemed to awaken at the presence of her beautiful neighbor, as when one, for the first time, stands before the great revelations of art. Mary's cheek glowed, her eyes seemed to grow deep with the enthusiasm of admiration, and after a few moments it seemed as if her delicate face and figure reflected the glowing loveliness of her visitor, just as the virgin snows of the Alps become incarnadine as they stand opposite the glorious radiance of a sunset sky. Madame de Frontignac was accustomed to the effect of her charms, but there was so much love in the admiration now directed towards her that her own warm nature was touched, and she threw out the glow of her feelings with a magnetic power. Mary never felt the cold, habitual reserve of her education so suddenly melt, never felt herself so naturally falling into language of confidence and endearment with a stranger, and as her face, so delicate and spiritual, grew bright with love, Madame de Frontignac thought she had never seen anything so beautiful, and stretching out her hands towards her, she exclaimed in her own language, "Mais, mon Dieu, mon enfant, que tu es belle!" Mary's deep blush at her ignorance of the language in which her visitor spoke recalled her to herself. She laughed a clear, silvery laugh, and laid her jewelled little hand on Mary's with a caressing movement. "He shall not teach you French, ma toute belle," she said, indicating the abbé by a pretty, wilful gesture. "I will teach you, and you shall teach me English. Oh, I shall try so hard to learn," she said. There was something inexpressibly pretty and quaint in the childish lisp with which she pronounced English. Mary was completely won over. She could have fallen into the arms of this wondrously beautiful fairy princess, expecting to be carried away by her to dreamland. Meanwhile, Mrs. Scudder was gravely discoursing with Colonel Burr and M. de Frontignac, and the abbé, a small and gentlemanly personage, with clear black eye, delicately cut features, and powdered hair, appeared to be absorbed in his efforts to follow the current of a conversation imperfectly understood. Burr, the while, though seeming to be entirely and politely absorbed in the conversation he was conducting, lost not a glimpse of the picturesque aside which was being enacted between the two fair ones whom he had thus brought together. He smiled quietly when he saw the effect Madame de Frontignac produced on Mary. After all, the child has flesh and blood, he thought, and may feel that there are more things in heaven and earth than she has dreamed of yet. A few French ideas won't hurt her. The arrangements about lessons being completed, the party returned to the carriage. Madame de Frontignac was enthusiastic in Mary's praise. "Cependant," she said, leaning back thoughtfully after having exhausted herself in superlatives, "cependant elle est dévote. Et à 19 comment cela se peut-il?" "It is the effect of her austere education," said Burr. "It is not possible for you to conceive how young people are trained in the religious families of this country." "But yet," said Madame, "it gives her a grace altogether peculiar. Something in her looks went to my heart. I could find it very easy to love her because she is really good." "The Queen of Hearts should know all that is possible in loving," said Burr. Somehow, of late, the compliments which fell so readily from those graceful lips had brought with them an unsatisfying pain. Until a woman really loves, flattery and compliment are often like her native air; but when that deeper feeling has once awakened in her, her instincts become marvellously acute to detect the false from the true. Madame de Frontignac longed for one strong, unguarded, real, earnest word from the man who had stolen from her her whole being. She was beginning to feel in some dim wise what an untold treasure she was daily giving for tinsel and dross. She leaned back in the carriage with a restless, burning cheek, and wondered why she was born to be so miserable. The thought of Mary's saintly face and tender eyes rose before her, as the moon rises on the eyes of some hot and fevered invalid, inspiring vague yearnings after an unknown, unattainable peace. Could some friendly power once have made her at that time clairvoyant, and shown her the reality of the man whom she was seeing through the prismatic glass of her own enkindled ideality, could she have seen the calculating quietness in which, during the intervals of a restless and sleepless ambition, he played upon her heartstrings as one uses a musical instrument to beguile a passing hour, how his only embarrassment was the fear that the feelings he was pleased to excite might become too warm and too strong, while as yet his relations to her husband were such as to make it dangerous to arouse his jealousy. And if he could have seen that pure ideal conception of himself which alone gave him power in the heart of this woman, that spotless, glorified image of a hero, without fear, without reproach, would he have felt a moment's shame and abasement at its utter falsehood? The poet says that the evil spirit stood abashed when he saw virtue in an angel form. How would a man then stand who meets face to face his own glorified, spotless ideal, made living by the boundless faith of some believing heart? The best must needs lay his hand on his mouth at this apparition. But woe to him who feels no redeeming power in the sacredness of this believing dream, who with calculating shrewdness uses this most touching miracle of love only to corrupt and destroy the loving. For him there is no sacrifice for sin, no place for repentance. His very mother might shrink in her grave to have him laid beside her. Madame de Frontignac had the high, honourable nature of the old blood of France and a touch of its romance. She was strung heroically and educated according to the notions of her caste and church, purely and religiously. True it is that one can scarcely call that education which teaches woman everything except herself, except the things that relate to her own peculiar womanly destiny, and on plea of the holiness of ignorance sends her without one word of just counsel into the temptations of life. Incredible as it may seem, Virginie de Frontignac had never read a romance or work of fiction of which love was the staple. The régime of the convent in this regard was inexorable. At 18 she was more thoroughly a child than most American girls at 13. On entrance into life, she was at first so dazzled and bewildered by the mere contrast of fashionable excitement with the quietness of the scenes in which she had hitherto grown up, that she had no time for reading or thought. All was one intoxicating frolic of existence, one dazzling, bewildering dream. He whose eye had measured her for his victim verified, if ever man did, the proverbial expression of the iron hand under the velvet glove. Under all his gentle suavities there was a fixed, inflexible will, a calm self-restraint, and a composed philosophical measurement of others, that fitted him to bear despotic rule over an impulsive, unguarded nature. The position at once accorded to him of her instructor in the English language and literature gave him 1,000 daily opportunities to touch and stimulate all that class of finer faculties, so restless and so perilous, and which a good man approaches always with a certain awe. It is said that he once asserted that he never beguiled a woman who did not come halfway to meet him, an observation much the same as a serpent might make in regard to his birds. The visit of the morning was followed by several others. Madame de Frontignac seemed to conceive for Mary one of those passionate attachments which women often conceive for anything fair and sympathizing, at those periods when their whole inner being is made vital by the approaches of a grand passion. It took only a few visits to make her as familiar as a child at the cottage, and the whole air of the Faubourg Saint-Germain seemed to melt away from her, as with the pliability peculiar to her nation she blended herself with the quiet pursuits of the family. Sometimes, in simple straw hat and white wrapper, she would lie down in the grass under the apple trees, or join Mary in an expedition to the barn for hens' eggs, or a run along the sea beach for shells, and her childish eagerness and delight on these occasions used to arouse the unqualified astonishment of Mrs. Katy Scudder. The doctor she regarded with a naïve astonishment, slightly tinctured with apprehension. She knew he was very religious, and stretched her comprehension to imagine what he might be like. She thought of Bossuet's sermons, walking about under a Protestant coat, and felt vaguely alarmed and sinful in his presence, as she used to when entering under the shadows of a cathedral. In her the religious sentiment, though vague, was strong. Nothing in the character of Burr had ever awakened so much disapprobation as his occasional sneers at religion. On such occasions she always reproved him with warmth, but excused him in her heart, because he was brought up a heretic. She held a special theological conversation with the abbé, whether salvation were possible to one outside of the true church, and had added to her daily prayer a particular invocation to the Virgin for him. The French lessons with her assistance proceeded prosperously. She became an inmate in Mrs. Marvyn's family also. The brown-eyed, sensitive woman loved her as a new poem. She felt enchanted by her, and the prosaic details of her household seemed touched to poetic life by her innocent interest and admiration. The young madame insisted on being taught to spin at the great wheel, and a very pretty picture she made of it, too, with her earnest gravity of endeavor, her deepening cheek, her graceful form, with some strange foreign scarf or jewelry waving and flashing in odd contrast with her work. "Do you know," she said one day while thus employed in the north room at Mrs. Marvyn's, "do you know Burr told me that princesses used to spin? He read me a beautiful story from the Odyssey about how Penelope cheated her lovers with her spinning while she was waiting for her husband to come home. He was gone to sea, Mary, her true love, you understand?" She turned on Mary a wicked glance, so full of intelligence that the snowdrop grew red as the inside of a sea-shell. "Mon enfant, thou hast a thought deep in here," she said to Mary one day as they sat together in the grass under the apple trees. "Why, what?" said Mary, with a startled and guilty look. "Why, what, petite?" said the fairy princess, whimsically mimicking her accent. "Ah, ma belle, you think I have no eyes. Virginie sees deep in here," she said, laying her hand playfully on Mary's heart. "Ah, petite," she said gravely and almost sorrowfully, "if you love him, wait for him. Don't marry another. It is dreadful not to have one's heart go with one's duty." "I shall never marry anybody," said Mary. "Never marry anybody," said the lady, imitating her accents in tones much like those of a bobolink. "Ah, my little saint, you cannot always live on nothing but the prayers, though prayers are very good. But, ma chère," she added in a low tone, "don't you ever marry that good man in there. Priests should not marry." "Ours are not priests, they are ministers," said Mary. "But why do you speak of him? He is like my father." "Virginie sees something," said the lady, shaking her head gravely. "She sees he loves little Mary." "Of course he does." "Of course he does. Ah, yes, and by comes the mamma, and she takes this little hand, and she says, 'Come, Mary,' and then she gives it to him, and then the poor jeune homme, when he comes back, finds not a bird in his poor little nest. Oh, c'est ennuyeux cela," she said, throwing herself back in the grass till the clover heads and buttercups closed over her. "I do assure you, dear madame." "I do assure you, dear Mary. Virginie knows. So lock up her words in your little heart. You will want them some day." There was a pause of some moments while the lady was watching the course of a cricket through the clover. At last, lifting her head, she spoke very gravely. "My little cat, it is dreadful to be married to a good man, and want to be good, and want to love him, and yet never like to have him take your hand, and be more glad when he is away than when he is at home. And then to think how different it would all be if it was only somebody else. That will be the way with you, if you let them lead you into this. So don't you do it, mon enfant." A thought seemed to cross Mary's mind as she turned to Madame de Frontignac and said earnestly, "If a good man were my husband, I would never think of another. I wouldn't let myself." "How could you help it, mignonne? Can you stop your thinking?" Mary said after a moment's blush, "I can try." "Ah, yes, but to try all one's life! Oh, Mary, that is too hard. Never do it, darling." And then Madame de Frontignac broke out into a caroling little French song, which started all the birds around into a general orchestral accompaniment. This conversation occurred just before Madame de Frontignac started for Philadelphia, whither her husband had been summoned as an agent in some of the ambitious intrigues of Burr. It was with a sigh of regret that she parted from her friends at the cottage. She made them a hasty good-bye call, alighting from a splendid barouche with 2 white horses, and filling their simple best room with the light of her presence for a last half-hour. When she bade good-bye to Mary, she folded her warmly to her heart, and her long lashes drooped heavily with tears. After her absence, the lessons were still pursued with the gentle, quiet little abbé, who seemed the most patient and assiduous of teachers. But in both houses there was that vague ennui, that sense of want which follows the fading of one of life's beautiful dreams. We bid her adieu for a season. We may see her again. End of section 22. Section 23 of the Minister's Wooing. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Minister's Wooing by Harriet Beecher Stowe, Chapter 20. The summer passed over the cottage noiselessly as our summers pass. There were white clouds walking in saintly troops over blue mirrors of sea. There were purple mornings, choral with bird singing. There were golden evenings with long eastward shadows. Apple blossoms died quietly in the deep orchard grass, and tiny apples waxed and rounded and ripened and gained stripes of gold and carmine, and the blue eggs broke into young robins that grew from gaping yellow-mouthed youth to fledged and outflying maturity. Came autumn with its long Indian summer, and winter with its flinty, sparkling snows, under which all nature lay a sealed and beautiful corpse. Came once more the spring winds, the lengthening days, the opening flowers, and the ever-renewing miracle of buds and blossoms on the apple trees around the cottage. A year had passed since the June afternoon when first we showed you Mary standing under the spotty shadows of the tree with the white dove on her hand, a year in which not many outward changes have been made in the relations of the actors of our story. Mary calmly spun and read and thought, now and then composing with care very English-French letters to be sent to Philadelphia to Madame de Frontignac, and receiving short missives of very French English in return. The cautions of Madame in regard to the doctor had not rippled the current of their calm, confiding intercourse, and the doctor, so very satisfied and happy in her constant society and affection, scarcely as yet meditated distinctly that he needed to draw her more closely to himself. If he had a passage to read, a page to be copied, a thought to express, was she not ever there, gentle, patient, unselfish, and scarce by the absence of a day did she let him perceive that his need of her was becoming so absolute that his hold on her must needs be made permanent. As to his salary and temporal concerns, they had suffered somewhat for his unpopular warfare with reigning sins, a fact which had rather reconciled Mrs. Scudder to the dilatory movement of her cherished hopes. Since James was gone, what need to press imprudently to new arrangements? Better give the little heart time to grow over before starting a subject which a certain womanly instinct told her might be met with a struggle. Somehow she never thought without a certain heart-sinking of Mary's look and tone the night she spoke with her about James. She had an awful presentiment that that tone of voice belonged to the things that cannot be shaken. But yet Mary seemed so even, so quiet, her delicate form filled out and rounded so beautifully, and she sang so cheerfully at her work, and above all she was so entirely silent about James, that Mrs. Scudder had hope. Ah, that silence! Do not listen to hear whom a woman praises to know where her heart is. Do not ask for whom she expresses the most earnest enthusiasm. But if there be one she once knew well, whose name she never speaks, if she seem to have an instinct to avoid every occasion of its mention, if when you speak she drops into silence and changes the subject, why, look there for something. Just as when going through deep meadow grass a bird flies ostentatiously up before you, you may know her nest is not there, but far off, under distant tufts of fern and buttercup, through which she has crept with a silent flutter in her spotted breast to act her pretty little falsehood before you. Poor Mary's little nest was along the sedgy margin of the seashore, where grow the tufts of goldenrod, where wave the reeds, where crimson, green, and purple seaweeds float up like torn fringes of Nereid vestures, and gold and silver shells lie on the wet wrinkles of the sands. The sea had become to her like a friend, with its ever-varying monotony. Somehow she loved this old, fresh, blue, babbling, restless giant, who had carried away her heart's love to hide him in some far-off palmy island, such as she had often heard him tell of in his sea romances. Sometimes she would wander out for an afternoon stroll on the rocks, and pause by the great spouting cave, now famous to Newport dilettanti, but then a sacred and impressive solitude. There the rising tide bursts with deafening strokes through a narrow opening into some inner cavern, which, with a deep thunder boom like the voice of an angry lion, casts its back in a high jet of foam into the sea. Mary often sat and listened to this hollow noise, and watched the ever-rising columns of spray as they reddened with the transpiercing beams of the afternoon sun, and thence her eye travelled far, far off over the shimmering starry blue, where sails looked no bigger than millers' wings, and it seemed sometimes as if a door were opening by which her soul might go out into some eternity, some abyss so wide and deep that fathomless lines of thought could not sound it. She was no longer a girl in a mortal body, but an infinite spirit, the adoring companion of infinite beauty and infinite love. As there was an hour when the fishermen of Galilee saw their Master transfigured, his raiment white and glistening, and his face like the light, so are there hours when our whole mortal life stands forth in a celestial radiance. From our daily lot falls off every weed of care, from our heart friends every speck and stain of earthly infirmity. Our horizon widens, and blue and amethyst and gold touch every object. Absent friends and friends gone on the last long journey stand once more together, bright with an immortal glow, and like the disciples who saw their Master floating in the clouds above them, we say, "Lord, it is good to be here." How fair the wife, the husband, the absent mother, the gray-haired father, the manly son, the bright-eyed daughter, seen in the actual present. All have some fault, some flaw, but absent we see them in their permanent and better selves. Of our distant home we remember not one dark day, not one servile care, nothing but the echo of its holy hymns and the radiance of its brightest days. Of our Father, not one hasty word, but only the fullness of his manly vigor and noble tenderness. Of our Mother, nothing of mortal weakness, but a glorified form of love. Of our brother, not one teasing, provoking word of brotherly freedom, but the proud beauty of his noblest hours. Of our sister, our child, only what is fairest and sweetest. This is to life the true ideal, the calm glass, wherein looking we shall see that whatever defects cling to us, they are not, after all, permanent, and that we are tending to something nobler than we yet are. It is the earnest of our inheritance until the redemption of the purchased possession. In the resurrection we shall see our friends forever as we see them in these clairvoyant hours. We are writing thus on, linking image and thought and feeling, and lingering over every flower and listening to every bird, because just before us there lies a dark valley, and we shrink and tremble to enter it. But it must come, and why do we delay? Towards evening, one afternoon in the latter part of June, Mary returned from one of these lonely walks by the sea, and entered the kitchen. It was still in its calm and sober cleanness. The tall clock ticked with a startling distinctness. From the half-closed door of her mother's bedroom, which stood ajar, she heard the chipper of Miss Prissy's voice. She stayed her light footsteps, and the words that fell on her ear were these: "Miss Marvyn fainted dead away. She stood it till he came to that, but then she just clapped both hands together as if she'd been shot, and fell right for'ard on the floor in a faint." What could this be? There was a quick, intense whirl of thoughts in Mary's mind, and then came one of those awful moments when the powers of life seem to make a dead pause, and all things stand still, and then all seem to fail under her, and the life to sink down, 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 till nothing was but one dim, vague, miserable consciousness. Mrs. Scudder and Miss Prissy were sitting, talking earnestly on the foot of the bed, when the door opened noiselessly, and Mary glided to them like a spirit. No colour in cheek or lip, her blue eyes wide with calm horror, and laying her little hand with a nervous grasp on Miss Prissy's arm, she said, "Tell me, what is it? Is he dead?" The two women looked at each other, and then Mrs. Scudder opened her arms. "My daughter! Oh, mother, mother!" Then fell that long, hopeless silence, broken only by hysteric sobs from Miss Prissy and answering ones from the mother. But she lay still and quiet, her blue eyes wide and clear, making an inarticulate moan. "Oh, are they sure? Can it be? Is he dead?" At last she gasped. "My child, it is too true. All we can say is, be still, and know that I am God." "I shall try to be still, mother," said Mary, with a piteous, hopeless voice, like the bleat of a dying lamb. "But I did not think he could die. I never thought of that. I never thought of it. Oh, mother, mother, mother! Oh, what shall I do?" They laid her on her mother's bed, the first and last resting place of broken hearts, and the mother sat down by her in silence. Miss Prissy stole away into the doctor's study and told him all that had happened. "It's the same to her," said Miss Prissy, with womanly reserve, "as if he'd been an own brother." "What was his spiritual state?" said the doctor musingly. Miss Prissy looked blank and answered mournfully, "I don't know." The doctor entered the room where Mary was lying with closed eyes. Those few moments seemed to have done the work of years, so pale and faded and sunken she looked. Nothing but the painful flutter of the eyelids and lips showed that she yet breathed. At a sign from Mrs. Scudder, he kneeled by the bed and began to pray. "Lord, thou hast been our dwelling place in all generations." Prayer deep, mournful, upheaving, like the swell of the ocean, surging upward under the pressure of mighty sorrows towards an almighty heart. The truly good are of one language in prayer. Whatever lines or angles of thought may separate them in other hours, when they pray in extremity, all good men pray alike. The Emperor Charles V. and Martin Luther, two great generals of opposite faiths, breathed out their dying struggle in the self-same words. There be many tongues and many languages of men, but the language of prayer is one by itself, in all and above all. It is the inspiration of that Spirit that is ever working with our spirit, and constantly lifting us higher than we know, and by our wants, by our woes, by our tears, by our yearnings, by our poverty, urging us with mightier and mightier force against those chains of sin which keep us from our God. We speak not of things conventionally called prayers, vain mutterings of unawakened spirits talking drowsily in sleep, but of such prayers as come when flesh and heart fail in mighty straits, then he who prays is a prophet, and a mightier than he speaks in him, for the Spirit helpeth our infirmities, for we know not what we should pray for as we ought, but the Spirit itself maketh intercession for us with groanings which cannot be uttered. So the voice of supplication, upheaving from that great heart, so childlike in its humility, rose with a wisdom and a pathos beyond what he dreamed in his intellectual hours. It uprose even as a strong angel, whose brow is solemnly calm, and whose wings shed healing dews of paradise. End of section 23. Section 24 of The Minister's Wooing. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Minister's Wooing by Harriet Beecher Stowe, Chapter 21. The next day broke calm and fair. The robins sang remorselessly in the apple tree, and were answered by bobolink, oriole, and a whole tribe of ignorant little bits of feathered happiness that danced among the leaves. Golden and glorious unclosed those purple eyelids of the east, and regally came up the sun, and the treacherous sea broke into 10,000 smiles, laughing and dancing with every ripple as unconsciously as if no form dear to human hearts had gone down beneath it. Oh, treacherous, deceiving beauty of outward things, beauty wherein throbs not one answering nerve to human pain. Mary rose early and was about her morning work. Her education was that of the soldier who must know himself no more, whom no personal pain must swerve from the slightest minutiae of duty. So she was there at her usual hour, dressed with the same cool neatness, her brown hair parted in satin bands, and only the colourless cheek and lip differing from the Mary of yesterday. How strange this external habit of living! One thinks how to stick in a pin and how to tie a string. One busies oneself with folding robes and putting away napkins the day after some stroke that has cut the inner life in two, with the heart's blood dropping quietly at every step. Yet it is better so. Happy those whom stern principle or long habit or hard necessity calls from the darkened room, the languid trance of pain in which the wearied heart longs to indulge, and gives this trite prose of common life at which our weak and wearied appetites so revolt. Mary never thought of such a thing as self-indulgence. This daughter of the Puritans had her seed within her, aerial in her delicacy as the blue-eyed flax flower with which they sowed their fields. She had yet its strong fibre, which no stroke of the flail could break. Bruising and hackling only made it fitter for uses of homely utility. Mary therefore opened the kitchen door at dawn, and after standing one moment to breathe the freshness, began spreading the cloth for an early breakfast. Mrs. Scudder, the meanwhile, was kneading the bread that had been set to rise overnight, and the oven was crackling and roaring with a large-throated, honest garrulousness. But ever and anon, as the mother worked, she followed the motions of her child anxiously. "Mary, my dear," she said, "the eggs are giving out. Hadn't you better run to the barn and get a few?" Most mothers are instinctive philosophers. No treatise on the laws of nervous fluids could have taught Mrs. Scudder a better role for this morning than her tender gravity and her constant expedients to break and ripple, by changing employments, that deep, deadly undercurrent of thoughts which she feared might undermine her child's life. Mary went into the barn, stopped a moment, and took out a handful of corn to throw to her hens, who had a habit of running towards her and cocking an expectant eye to her little hand whenever she appeared. All came at once flying towards her, speckled, whiting, gleamy, with hues between of tawny orange gold, the cocks magnificent with the blade-like waving of their tails, and as they chattered and cackled and pressed and crowded about her, pecking the corn even where it lodged in the edge of her little shoes, she said, "Poor things, I am glad they enjoy it." and even this one little act of love to the ignorant fellowship below her carried away some of the choking pain which seemed all the while suffocating her heart. Then, climbing into the hay, she sought the nest and filled her little basket with eggs, warm, translucent, pinky white in their freshness. She felt for a moment the customary animation in surveying her new treasures, but suddenly, like a vision rising before her, came a remembrance of once when she and James were children together and had been seeking eggs just there. He flashed before her eyes, the bright boy with the long black lashes, the dimpled cheeks, the merry eyes, just as he stood and threw the hay over her when they tumbled and laughed together, and she sat down with a sick faintness and then turned and walked wearily in. End of section 24. Section 25 of The Minister's Wooing. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Minister's Wooing by Harriet Beecher Stowe, Chapter 22. Mary returned to the house with her basket of warm, fresh eggs, which she set down mournfully upon the table. In her heart there was one conscious want and yearning, and that was to go to the friends of him she had lost, to go to his mother. The first impulse of bereavement is to stretch out the hands towards what was nearest and dearest to the departed. Her dove came fluttering down out of the tree and settled on her hand and began asking in his dumb way to be noticed. Mary stroked his white feathers and bent her head down over them till they were wet with tears. "Oh, birdie, you live, but he is gone," she said. Then suddenly putting it gently from her and going near and throwing her arms around her mother's neck, "Mother," she said, "I want to go up to Cousin Ellen's." This was the familiar name by which she always called Mrs. Marvyn. "Can't you go with me, Mother?" "My daughter, I have thought of it. I hurried about my baking this morning, and sent word to Mr. Jenkins that he needn't come to see about the chimney, because I expected to go as soon as breakfast should be out of the way. So hurry now, boil some eggs, and get on the cold beef and potatoes, for I see Solomon and Amaziah coming in with the milk. They'll want their breakfast immediately." The breakfast for the hired men was soon arranged on the table, and Mary sat down to preside while her mother was going on with her baking, introducing various loaves of white and brown bread into the capacious oven by means of a long iron shovel, and discoursing at intervals with Solomon with regard to the different farming operations which he had in hand for the day. Solomon was a tall, large-boned man, brawny and angular, with a face tanned by the sun, and graven with those considerate lines which New England so early writes on the faces of her sons. He was reputed an oracle in matters of agriculture and cattle, and, like oracles generally, was prudently sparing of his responses. Amaziah was one of those uncouth, overgrown boys of 18 whose physical bulk appears to have so suddenly developed that the soul has more matter than she has learned to recognize, so that the hapless individual is always awkwardly conscious of too much limb. And in Amaziah's case this consciousness grew particularly distressing when Mary was in the room. He liked to have her there, he said, but somehow she was so white and pretty, she made him feel sort of awful like. Of course, as such poor mortals always do, he must on this particular morning blunder into precisely the wrong subject. "S'pose you've heerd the news that Jeduthun Pettibone brought home in the Flying Scud 'bout the wreck of the Monsoon? It's an awful provident, that ar is, ain't it? Why, Jeduthun says she just crushed like an eggshell," and with that Amaziah illustrated the fact by crushing an eggshell in his great brown hand. Mary did not answer. She could not grow any paler than she was before. A dreadful curiosity came over her, but her lips could frame no question. Amaziah went on. "You see, the cap'n, he got killed with a spar when the blow fust come on, and Jim Marvyn, he commanded, and Jeduthun says that he seemed to have the spirit of 10 men in him. He worked and he watched, and he was everywhere at once, and he kept 'em all up for 3 days, till finally they lost their rudder and went driving right onto the rocks. When they come in sight, he come up on deck and says he, well, my boys, we're heading right into eternity, says he, and our chances for this world ain't worth mentioning any on us, but we'll all have one trial for our lives. Boys, I've tried to do my duty by you in the ship, but God's will be done. All I have to ask now is that if any of you get to shore, you will find my mother and tell her I died thinking of her and father and my dear friends. That was the last Duthan saw of him, for in a few minutes more the ship struck, and then it was every man for himself. Laws, Duthan says there couldn't nobody have stood beating agin them rocks unless they was all leather and injure rubber like him. Why, he says the waves would take strong men and just crush 'em against the rocks like smashing a pie plate. Here Mary's paleness became livid. She made a hasty motion to rise from the table, and Solomon trod on the foot of the narrator. You seem to forget that friends and relations has feelin's, he said, as Mary hastily went into her own room. Amaziah, suddenly awakened to the fact that he had been trespassing, sat with mouth half open and a stupefied look of perplexity on his face for a moment, and then rising hastily said, well, Saul, I guess I'll go and yoke up the steers. At 8 o'clock all the morning toils were over, the wide kitchen cool and still, and the one-horse wagon standing at the door, into which climbed Mary, her mother, and the doctor, for though invested with no spiritual authority and charged with no ritual or form for hours of affliction, the religion of New England always expects her minister as a first visitor in every house of mourning. The ride was a sorrowful and silent one. The doctor, propped upon his cane, seemed to reflect deeply. Have you been at all conversant with the exercises of our young friend's mind on the subject of religion? He asked. Mrs. Scudder did not at first reply. The remembrance of James's last letter flashed over her mind, and she felt the vibration of the frail child beside her, in whom every nerve was quivering. After a moment she said, it does not become us to judge the spiritual state of any one. James's mind was in an unsettled way when he left, but who can say what wonders may have been effected by divine grace since then? This conversation fell on the soul of Mary like the sound of clods falling on a coffin to the ear of one buried alive. She heard it with a dull, smothering sense of suffocation, that question to be raised, and about one, too, for whom she could have given her own soul. At this moment she felt how idle is the mere hope or promise of personal salvation, made to one who has passed beyond the life of self and struck deep the roots of his existence in others. She did not utter a word. How could she? A doubt, the faintest shadow of a doubt in such a case, falls on the soul with the weight of mountain certainty, and in that short ride she felt what an infinite pain may be locked in one small, silent breast. The wagon drew up to the house of mourning. Cato stood at the gate and came forward officiously to help them out. "Master and missus would be glad to see you," he said. "It's a dreadful stroke has come upon 'em." Candace appeared at the door. There was a majesty of sorrow in her bearing as she received them. She said not a word, but pointed with her finger towards the inner room. But as Mary lifted up her faded, weary face to hers, her whole soul seemed to heave towards her like a billow, and she took her up in her arms and broke forth into sobbing, and carrying her in as if she had been a child, set her down in the inner room and sat down beside her. Mrs. Marvyn and her husband sat together, holding each other's hands, the open Bible between them. For a few moments nothing was to be heard but sobs and unrestrained weeping, and then all kneeled down while the doctor prayed. After they rose up, Mr. Zebedee Marvyn stood for a moment thoughtfully, and then said, "If it had pleased the Lord to give me a sure evidence of my son's salvation, I could have given him up with all my heart, but now, whatever there may be, I have seen none." He stood in an attitude of hopeless, heart-smitten dejection, which contrasted painfully with his usual upright carriage and the firm lines of his face. Mrs. Marvyn started as if a sword had pierced her, passed her arm round Mary's waist with a strong, nervous clasp, unlike her usual calm self, and said, "Stay with me, daughter, to-day. Stay with me." "Mary can stay as long as you wish, cousin," said Mrs. Scudder. "We have nothing to call her home." "Come with me," said Mrs. Marvyn to Mary. opening an adjoining door into her bedroom and drawing her in with a sort of suppressed vehemence. "I want you. I must have you." "Mrs. Marvyn's state alarms me," said her husband, looking apprehensively after her when the door was closed. "She has not shed any tears, nor slept any, since she heard this news. You know that her mind has been in a peculiar and unhappy state with regard to religious things for many years. I was in hopes she might feel free to open her exercises of mind to the doctor." "Perhaps she will feel more freedom with Mary," said the doctor. "There is no healing for such troubles except in unconditional submission to infinite wisdom and goodness. The Lord reigneth, and will at last bring infinite good out of evil, whether our small portion of existence be included or not." After a few moments more of conference, Mrs. Scudder and the doctor departed, leaving Mary alone in the house of mourning. End of section 25. Section 26 of The Minister's Wooing. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Minister's Wooing by Harriet Beecher Stowe, Chapter 23. We have said before what we now repeat, that it is impossible to write a story of New England life and manners for superficial thought or shallow feeling. They who would fully understand the springs which move the characters with whom we now associate must go down with us to the very depths. Never was there a community where the roots of common life shot down so deeply and were so intensely grappled around things sublime and eternal. The founders of it were a body of confessors and martyrs who turned their backs on the whole glory of the visible, to found in the wilderness a republic of which the God of heaven and earth should be the sovereign power. For the first 100 years grew this community, shut out by a fathomless ocean from the existing world, and divided by an antagonism not less deep from all the reigning ideas of nominal Christendom. In a community thus unworldly must have arisen a mode of thought, energetic, original, and sublime. The leaders of thought and feeling were the ministry, and we boldly assert that the spectacle of the early ministry of New England was one to which the world gives no parallel. Living an intense, earnest, practical life, mostly tilling the earth with their own hands, they yet carried on the most startling and original religious investigations with a simplicity that might have been deemed audacious were it not so reverential. All old issues relating to government, religion, ritual, and forms of church organization having for them passed away, they went straight to the heart of things, and boldly confronted the problem of universal being. They had come out from the world as witnesses to the most solemn and sacred of human rights. They had accustomed themselves boldly to challenge and dispute all sham pretensions and idolatries of past ages, to question the right of kings in the state and of prelates in the church. And now they turned the same bold inquiries towards the eternal throne, and threw down their glove in the lists as authorized defenders of every mystery in the eternal government. The task they proposed to themselves was that of reconciling the most tremendous facts of sin and evil, present and eternal, with those conceptions of infinite power and benevolence which their own strong and generous natures enabled them so vividly to realize. In the intervals of planting and harvesting, they were busy with the toils of adjusting the laws of a universe. Solemnly simple, they made long journeys in their old one-horse chaises to settle with each other some nice point of celestial jurisprudence, and to compare their maps of the infinite. Their letters to each other form a literature altogether unique. Hopkins sends to Edwards the Younger his scheme of the universe, in which he starts with the proposition that God is infinitely above all obligations of any kind to his creatures. Edwards replies with the brusque comment, "This is wrong. God has no more right to injure a creature than a creature has to injure God, and each probably about that time preached a sermon on his own views, which was discussed by every farmer in intervals of plough and hoe, by every woman and girl at loom, spinning wheel, or wash tub. New England was one vast sea, surging from depths to heights, with thought and discussion on the most insoluble of mysteries. And it is to be added that no man or woman accepted any theory or speculation simply as theory or speculation. All was profoundly real and vital, a foundation on which actual life was based with intensest earnestness. The views of human existence which resulted from this course of training were gloomy enough to oppress any heart which did not rise above them by triumphant faith, or sink below them by brutish insensibility, for they included every moral problem of natural or revealed religion, divested of all those softening poetries and tender draperies which forms, ceremonies, and rituals had thrown around them in other parts and ages of Christendom. The human race, without exception, coming into existence under God's wrath and curse, with a nature so fatally disordered that, although perfect free agents, men were infallibly certain to do nothing to divine acceptance until regenerated by the supernatural aid of God's Spirit, this aid being given to a certain decreed number of the human race only, the rest with enough free agency to make them responsible, but without this indispensable assistance, exposed to the malignant assaults of evil spirits, versed in every art of temptation, were sure to fall hopelessly into perdition. The standard of what constituted a true regeneration, as presented in such treatises as Edwards on the Affections and others of the times, made this change to be something so high, disinterested, and superhuman, so removed from all natural and common habits and feelings, that the most earnest and devoted, whose whole life had been a constant travail of endeavour, a tissue of almost unearthly disinterestedness, often lived and died with only a glimmering hope of its attainment. According to any views then entertained of the evidences of a true regeneration, the number of the whole human race who could be supposed as yet to have received this grace was so small, that as to any numerical valuation it must have been expressed by an infinitesimal. Dr. Hopkins in many places distinctly recognizes the fact that the greater part of the human race up to his time had been eternally lost, and boldly assumes the ground that this amount of sin and suffering, being the best and most necessary means of the greatest final amount of happiness, was not merely permitted, but distinctly chosen, decreed, and provided for as essential in the schemes of infinite benevolence. He held that this decree not only permitted each individual act of sin, but also took measures to make it certain, though by an exercise of infinite skill it accomplished this result without violating human free agency. The preaching of those times was animated by an unflinching consistency which never shrank from carrying an idea to its remotest logical verge. The sufferings of the lost were not kept from view, but proclaimed with a terrible power. Dr. Hopkins boldly asserts that all the use which God will have for them is to suffer. This is all the end they can answer. Therefore, all their faculties and their whole capacities will be employed and used for this end. The body can by omnipotence be made capable of suffering the greatest imaginable pain without producing dissolution or abating the least degree of life or sensibility. One way in which God will show his power in the punishment of the wicked will be in strengthening and upholding their bodies and souls in torments which otherwise would be intolerable. The sermons preached by President Edwards on this subject are so terrific in their refined poetry of torture that very few persons of quick sensibility could read them through without agony, and it is related that when in those calm and tender tones which never rose to passionate enunciation he read these discourses, the house was often filled with shrieks and wailings, and that a brother minister once laid hold of his skirts, exclaiming in an involuntary agony, "Oh, Mr. Edwards, Mr. Edwards, is God not a God of mercy?" Not that these men were indifferent or insensible to the dread words they spoke. Their whole lives and deportment bore thrilling witness to their sincerity. Edwards set apart special days of fasting in view of the dreadful doom of the lost, in which he was wont to walk the floor, weeping and wringing his hands. Hopkins fasted every Saturday. David Brainerd gave up every refinement of civilized life to weep and pray at the feet of hardened savages, if by any means he might save one. All, by lives of eminent purity and earnestness, gave awful weight and sanction to their words. If we add to this statement the fact that it was always proposed to every inquiring soul, as an evidence of regeneration, that it should truly and heartily accept all the ways of God, thus declared right and lovely, and from the heart submit to him as the only just and good, it will be seen what materials of tremendous internal conflict and agitation were all the while working in every bosom. Almost all the histories of religious experience of those times relate paroxysms of opposition to God and fierce rebellion, expressed in language which appalls the very soul, followed at length by mysterious elevations of faith and reactions of confiding love, the result of divine interposition, which carried the soul far above the region of the intellect into that of direct spiritual intuition. President Edwards records that he was once in this state of enmity, that the facts of the divine administration seemed horrible to him, and that this opposition was overcome by no course of reasoning, but by an inward and sweet sense, which came to him once when walking alone in the fields, and looking up into the blue sky, he saw the blending of the divine majesty with a calm, sweet, and almost infinite meekness. The piety which grew up under such a system was of necessity energetic. It was the uprousing of the whole energy of the human soul, pierced and wrenched and probed from her lowest depths to her topmost heights, with every awful life force possible to existence. He whose faith in God came clear through these terrible tests would be sure never to know greater ones. He might certainly challenge earth or heaven, things present or things to come, to swerve him from this grand allegiance. But it is to be conceded that these systems, so admirable in relation to the energy, earnestness, and acuteness of their authors, when received as absolute truth and as a basis of actual life, had on minds of a certain class the effect of a slow poison, producing life habits of morbid action very different from any which ever followed the simple reading of the Bible. They differ from the New Testament as the living embrace of a friend does from his lifeless body, mapped out under the knife of the anatomical demonstrator. Every nerve and muscle is there, but to a sensitive spirit there is the very chill of death in the analysis. All systems that deal with the infinite are, besides, exposed to danger from small unsuspected admixtures of human error which become deadly when carried to such vast results. The smallest speck of earth's dust in the focus of an infinite lens appears magnified among the heavenly orbs as a frightful monster. Thus it happened that while strong spirits walked, palm-crowned, with victorious hymns along these sublime paths, feebler and more sensitive ones lay along the track, bleeding away in lifelong despair. Fearful to them were the shadows that lay over the cradle and the grave. The mother clasped her babe to her bosom, and looked with shuddering to the awful coming trial of free agency, with its terrible responsibilities and risks, and as she thought of the infinite chances against her beloved, almost wished it might die in infancy. But when the stroke of death came, and some young thoughtless head was laid suddenly low, who can say what silent anguish of loving hearts sounded the dread depths of eternity with the awful question, Where? In no other time or place of Christendom have so fearful issues been presented to the mind. Some church interposed its protecting shield. The Christian born and baptized child was supposed in some wise rescued from the curse of the fall and related to the great redemption, to be a member of Christ's family, and if ever so sinful, still enfolded in some vague sphere of hope and protection. Augustine solaced the dread anxieties of trembling love by prayers offered for the dead. In times when the church above and on earth presented itself to the eye of the mourner as a great assembly, with one accord lifting interceding hands for the parted soul. But the clear logic and intense individualism of New England deepened the problems of the Augustinian faith, while they swept away all those softening provisions so earnestly clasped to the throbbing heart of that great poet of theology. No rite, no form, no paternal relation, no faith or prayer of church, earthly or heavenly, interposed the slightest shield between the trembling spirit and eternal justice. The individual entered eternity alone, as if he had no interceding relation to the universe. This, then, was the awful dread which was constantly underlying life. This it was which caused the tolling bell in green hollows and lonely dells to be a sound which shook the soul and searched the heart with fearful questions, and this it was that was lying with mountain weight on the soul of the mother, too keenly agonized to feel that doubt in such a case was any less a torture than the most dreadful certainty. Hers was a nature more reasoning than creative and poetic, and whatever she believed bound her mind in strictest chains to its logical results. She delighted in the regions of mathematical knowledge, and walked them as a native home. But the commerce with abstract certainties fitted her mind still more to be stiffened and enchained by glacial reasonings in regions where spiritual intuitions are as necessary as wings to birds. Mary was by nature of the class who never reason abstractly, whose intellections all begin in the heart, which sends them colored with its warm life tint to the brain. Her perceptions of the same subjects were as different from Mrs. Marvyn's as his who revels only in color from his who is busy with the dry details of mere outline. The one mind was arranged like a map, and the other like a picture. In all the system which had been explained to her, her mind selected points on which it seized with intense sympathy, which it dwelt upon and expanded till all else fell away. The sublimity of disinterested benevolence, the harmony and order of a system tending in its final results to infinite happiness, the goodness of God, the love of a self-sacrificing Redeemer, were all so many glorious pictures which she revolved in her mind with small care for their logical relations. Mrs. Marvyn had never in all the course of their intimacy opened her mouth to Mary on the subject of religion. It was not an uncommon incident of those times for persons of great elevation and purity of character to be familiarly known and spoken of as living under a cloud of religious gloom, and it was simply regarded as one more mysterious instance of the workings of that infinite decree which denied to them the special illumination of the Spirit. When Mrs. Marvyn had drawn Mary with her into her room, she seemed like a person almost in frenzy. She shut and bolted the door, drew her to the foot of the bed, and throwing her arms round her, rested her hot and throbbing forehead on her shoulder. She pressed her thin hand over her eyes, and then suddenly, drawing back, looked her in the face, as one resolved to speak something long suppressed. Her soft brown eyes had a flash of despairing wildness in them, like that of a hunted animal turning in its death struggle on its pursuer. "Mary," she said, "I can't help it. Don't mind what I say, but I must speak or die. Mary, I cannot, will not be resigned. It is all hard, unjust, cruel. To all eternity I will say so. To me there is no goodness, no justice, no mercy in anything. Life seems to me the most tremendous doom that can be inflicted on a helpless being. What had we done that it should be sent upon us? Why were we made to love so, to hope so, our hearts so full of feeling, and all the laws of nature marching over us, never stopping for our agony, why, we can suffer so in this life that we had better never have been born. But, Mary, think what a moment life is. Think of those awful ages of eternity, and then think of all God's power and knowledge used on the lost to make them suffer. Think that all but the merest fragment of mankind have gone into this, are in it now. The number of the elect is so small we can scarce count them for anything. Think what noble minds, what warm, generous hearts, what splendid natures are wrecked and thrown away by thousands and tens of thousands. How we love each other, how our hearts weave into each other, how more than glad we should be to die for each other. And all this ends, oh God, how must it end? Mary, it isn't my sorrow only. What right have I to mourn? Is my son any better than any other mother's son? Thousands of thousands, whose mothers love them as I love mine, are gone there. Oh, my wedding day, why did they rejoice? Brides should wear mourning. The bells should toll for every wedding. Every new family is built over this awful pit of despair, and only 1 in 1,000 escapes. Pale, aghast, horror-stricken, Mary stood dumb as one who in the dark and storm sees by the sudden glare of lightning a chasm yawning underfoot. It was amazement and dimness of anguish. The dreadful words struck on the very center where her soul rested. She felt as if the point of a wedge were being driven between her life and her life's life, between her and her God. She clasped her hands instinctively on her bosom as if to hold there some cherished image, and said in a piercing voice of supplication, my God, oh, where art thou? Mrs. Marvyn walked up and down the room with a vivid spot of red in each cheek and a baleful fire in her eyes, talking in rapid soliloquy, scarcely regarding her listener, absorbed in her own enkindled thoughts. Dr. Hopkins says that this is all best, better than it would have been in any other possible way, that God chose it because it was for a greater final good, that he not only chose it but took means to make it certain, that he ordains every sin and does all that is necessary to make it certain, that he creates the vessels of wrath and fits them for destruction, and that he has an infinite knowledge by which he can do it without violating their free agency. So much the worse. What a use of infinite knowledge! What if men should do so? What if a father should take means to make it certain that his poor little child should be an abandoned wretch without violating his free agency? So much the worse, I say. They say he does this so that he may show to all eternity by their example the evil nature of sin and its consequences. This is all that the greater part of the human race have been used for yet. And it is all right, because an overplus of infinite happiness is yet to be wrought out by it. It is not right. No possible amount of good to ever so many can make it right to deprave ever so few. Happiness and misery cannot be measured so. I never can think it right, never. Yet they say our salvation depends on our loving God, loving him better than ourselves, loving him better than our dearest friends. It is impossible. It is contrary to the laws of my nature. I can never love God. I can never praise him. I am lost, lost, lost. And what is worse, I cannot redeem my friends. Oh, I could suffer forever, how willingly, if I could save him. But, oh, eternity, eternity, frightful, unspeakable woe, no end, no bottom, no shore, no hope. Oh, God, oh, God. Mrs. Marvyn's eyes grew wilder. She walked the floor, wringing her hands, and her words, mingled with the shrieks and moans, became whirling and confused, as when in autumn a storm drives the leaves in dizzy mazes. Mary was alarmed. The ecstasy of despair was just verging on insanity. She rushed out and called Mr. Marvyn. "Oh, come in, do, quick. I am afraid her mind is going," she said. "It is what I feared," he said, rising from where he sat reading his great Bible with an air of heartbroken dejection. "Since she heard this news, she has not slept nor shed a tear. The Lord hath covered us with a cloud in the day of his fierce anger." He came into the room and tried to take his wife to his arms. She pushed him violently back, her eyes glistening with a fierce light. "Leave me alone," she said. "I am a lost spirit." These words were uttered in a shriek that went through Mary's heart like an arrow. At this moment, Candace, who had been anxiously listening at the door for an hour past, suddenly burst into the room. "Lor bless ye, Squire Marvin, we won't have her going on dis yer way," she said. "Do talk gospel to her, can't ye? Ef you can't, I will." "Come, ye poor little lamb," she said, walking straight up to Mrs. Marvin. "Come to old Candace." And with that she gathered the pale form to her bosom and sat down and began rocking her as if she had been a babe. "Honey, darling, ye ain't right. Dar's a dreadful mistake somewhar," she said. "Why, the Lord ain't like what you think. He loves you, honey. Why, just feel how I love you. Poor old black Candace, and I ain't better'n him as made me. Who was it wore the crown of thorns, lamb? Who was it sweat great drops of blood? Who was it said, 'Father, forgive them'? Say, honey, wasn't it the Lord that made you? Dar, now, you're crying. Cry away and ease your poor little heart. He died for Master Jim, loved him, and died for him. Just give up his sweet, precious body and soul for him on the cross. Lord, just leave him in Jesus' hands. Why, honey, there's the very print of the nails in his hands now." The floodgates were rent, and healing sobs and tears shook the frail form, as a faded lily shakes under the soft rains of summer. All in the room wept together. "Now, honey," said Candace, after a pause of some minutes, "I knows our doctor's a mighty good man, and larned and in fair weather. I hain't no bejection to ye hearin' all about dese here great and mighty tings he's got to say. But, honey, dey won't do for you now. Sick folk mustn't hab strong meat. In times like dese, der just ain't but one ting to come to, and dat ar's Jesus. Just come right down to whar poor old black Candace has to stay allers. It's a good place, darling. Look right at Jesus. Tell your honey you can't live no other way now. Don't you remember how he looked on his mother when she stood fainting and trembling under the cross, just like you? He knows all about mothers' hearts. He won't break yours. It was just 'cause he knowed we'd come into straits like this here dat he went through all these things. Him the Lord of glory. It's this him you was a-talking about. Him you can't love. Look at him and see if you can. Look and see what he is. Don't ask no questions, and don't go to no reasonings. Just look at him, hanging dar, so sweet and patient on the cross. All they could do couldn't stop his loving 'em. He prayed for 'em with all the breath he had. There's a God you can love, ain't there? Candace loves him, poor old foolish black wicked Candace, and she knows he loves her." And here Candace broke down into torrents of weeping. They laid the mother, faint and weary, on her bed, and beneath the shadow of that suffering cross came down a healing sleep on those weary eyelids. "Honey," said Candace mysteriously, after she had drawn Mary out of the room, "don't ye go for to troublin' your mind wid dis here. I'm clar Massa James is one of de 'lect, and I'm clar dar's considerable more of de 'lect dan people think. Why, Jesus didn't die for nothing. All dat love ain't gwine to be wasted. De 'lect is more'n you or I knows, honey. Dar's the Spirit. He'll give it to 'em. And ef Massa James is called and took, depend upon it, de Lord has got him ready. Course he has. So don't you go to layin' on your poor old heart what no mortal creature can live under, 'cause as we's got to live in dis here world, it's quite clear the Lord must ha' fixed it so we can. And if things was as some folks suppose, why, we couldn't live, and there wouldn't be no sense in anything that goes on." The sudden shock of these scenes was followed, in Mrs. Marvin's case, by a low, lingering fever. Her room was darkened, and she lay on her bed, a pale, suffering form, with scarcely the ability to raise her hand. The shimmering twilight of the sick room fell on white napkins spread over stands, where constantly appeared new vials, big and little, as the physician made his daily visit, and prescribed now this drug and now that for a wound that had struck through the soul. Mary remained many days at the White House, because to the invalid no step, no voice, no hand was like hers. We see her there now, as she sits in the glimmering by the bed curtains, her head a little drooped, as droops a snowdrop over a grave. One ray of light from a round hole in the closed shutters falls on her smooth parted hair, her small hands clasped on her knees, her mouth has lines of sad compression, and in her eyes are infinite questionings. End of section 26. Section 27 of The Minister's Wooing. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Minister's Wooing by Harriet Beecher Stowe, Chapter 24, Part 1. When Mrs. Marvyn began to amend, Mary returned to the home cottage and resumed the details of her industrious and quiet life. Between her and her two best friends had fallen a curtain of silence. The subject that filled all her thoughts could not be named between them. The doctor often looked at her pale cheeks and drooping form with a face of honest sorrow, and heaved deep sighs as she passed, but he did not find any power within himself by which he could approach her. When he would speak, and she turned her sad, patient eyes so gently on him, the words went back again to his heart, and there, taking a second thought, spread upward wing in prayer. Mrs. Scudder sometimes came to her room after she was gone to bed, and found her weeping, and when gently she urged her to sleep, she would wipe her eyes so patiently, and turn her head with such obedient sweetness, that her mother's heart utterly failed her. For hours Mary sat in her room with James's last letter spread out before her. How anxiously had she studied every word and phrase in it, weighing them to see if the hope of eternal life were in them. How she dwelt on those last promises. Had he kept them? Ah, to die without one word more. Would no angel tell her? Would not the loving God, who knew all, just whisper one word? He must have read the little Bible. What had he thought? What did he feel in that awful hour when he felt himself drifting on to that fearful eternity? Perhaps he had been regenerated. Perhaps there had been a sudden change. Who knows? She had read of such things. Perhaps, in that perhaps lies a world of anguish. Love will not hear of it. Love dies for certainty. Against an uncertainty, who can brace the soul? We put all our forces of faith and prayer against it, and it goes down just as a buoy sinks in the water, and the next moment it is up again. The soul fatigues itself with efforts which come and go in waves, and when with laborious care she has adjusted all things in the light of hope, back flows the tide and sweeps all away. In such struggles life spends itself fast. An inward wound does not carry one deathward more surely than this worst wound of the soul. God has made us so mercifully that there is no certainty, however dreadful, to which life forces do not in time adjust themselves. But to uncertainty there is no possible adjustment. Where is he? Oh, question of questions! Question which we suppress, but which a power of infinite force still urges on the soul, who feels a part of herself torn away. Mary sat at her window in evening hours and watched the slanting sunbeams through the green blades of grass, and thought 1 year ago he stood there, with his well-knit manly form, his bright eye, his buoyant hope, his victorious mastery of life. And where was he now? Was his heart as sick, longing for her, as hers for him? Was he looking back to earth and its joys with pangs of unutterable regret? Or had a divine power interpenetrated his soul, and lighted there the flame of a celestial love which bore him far above earth? If he were among the lost, in what age of eternity could she ever be blessed? Could Christ be happy if those who were one with him were sinful and accursed? And could Christ's own loved ones be happy when those with whom they have exchanged being, in whom they live and feel, are as wandering stars, for whom is reserved the mist of darkness for ever? She had been taught that the agonies of the lost would be for ever in sight of the saints, without abating in the least their eternal joys. nay, that they would find in it increasing motives to praise and adoration. Could it be so? Would the last act of the great bridegroom of the church be to strike from the heart of his purified bride those yearnings of self-devoting love which his whole example had taught her, and in which she reflected, as in a glass, his own nature? If not, is there not some provision by which those roots of deathless love which Christ's betrothed ones strike into other hearts shall have a divine redeeming power? Question vital as life-blood to 10,000 hearts, fathers, mothers, wives, husbands, to all who feel the infinite sacredness of love. After the first interview with Mrs. Marvyn, the subject which had so agitated them was not renewed. She had risen at last from her sick bed, as thin and shadowy as a faded moon after sunrise. Candace often shook her head mournfully, as her eyes followed her about her daily tasks. Once only with Mary she alluded to the conversation which had passed between them. It was one day when they were together spinning in the north upper room that looked out upon the sea. It was a glorious day. A ship was coming in under full sail, with white gleaming wings. Mrs. Marvyn watched it a few moments, the gay creature so full of exultant life, and then smothered down an inward groan, and Mary thought she heard her saying, "Thy will be done." "Mary," she said gently, "I hope you will forget all I said to you that dreadful day. It had to be said, or I should have died. Mary, I begin to think that it is not best to stretch our minds with reasonings where we are so limited, where we can know so little. I am quite sure there must be dreadful mistakes somewhere. It seems to me irreverent and shocking that a child should oppose a father or a creature its creator. I never should have done it, only that where direct questions are presented to the judgment, one cannot help judging. If one is required to praise a being as just and good, one must judge of his actions by some standard of right, and we have no standard but such as our Creator has placed in us. I have been told it was my duty to attend to these subjects, and I have tried to, and the result has been that the facts presented seem wholly irreconcilable with any notions of justice or mercy that I am able to form. If these be the facts, I can only say that my nature is made entirely opposed to them. If I followed the standard of right they present, and acted according to my small mortal powers on the same principles, I should be a very bad person. Any father who should make such use of power over his children as they say the Deity does with regard to us would be looked upon as a monster by our very imperfect moral sense. Yet I cannot say that the facts are not so. When I heard the doctor's sermons on sin, a necessary means of the greatest good, I could not extricate myself from the reasoning. I have thought in desperate moments of giving up the Bible itself, but what do I gain? Do I not see the same difficulty in nature? I see everywhere a being whose main ends seem to be beneficent, but whose good purposes are worked out at terrible expense of suffering, and apparently by the total sacrifice of myriads of sensitive creatures. I see unflinching order, general goodwill, but no sympathy, no mercy. Storms, earthquakes, volcanoes, sickness, death go on without regarding us. Everywhere I see the most hopeless, unrelieved suffering, and for aught I see it may be eternal. Immortality is a dreadful chance, and I would rather never have been. The doctor's dreadful system is, I confess, much like the laws of nature, about what one may reason out from them. There is but just one thing remaining, and that is, as Candace said, the cross of Christ. If God so loved us, if he died for us, greater love hath no man than this. It seems to me that love is shown here in the two highest forms possible to our comprehension. We see a being who gives himself for us, and more than that, harder than that, a being who consents to the suffering of a dearer than self. Mary, I feel that I must love more, to give up one of my children to suffer, than to consent to suffer myself. There is a world of comfort to me in the words, He that spared not his own Son, but delivered him up for us all, how shall he not with them also freely give us all things? These words speak to my heart. I can interpret them by my own nature, and I rest on them. If there is a fathomless mystery of sin and sorrow, there is a deeper mystery of God's love. So, Mary, I try Candace's way. I look at Christ. I pray to him. If he that has seen him has seen the Father, it is enough. I rest there. I wait. What I know not now, I shall know hereafter. Mary kept all things and pondered them in her heart. She could speak to no one, not to her mother nor to her spiritual guide, for had she not passed to a region beyond theirs? As well might those on the hither side of mortality instruct the souls gone beyond the veil, as souls outside a great affliction guide those who are struggling in it. That is a mighty baptism, and only Christ can go down with us into those waters. Mrs. Scudder and the doctor only marked that she was more than ever conscientious in every duty, and that she brought to life's daily realities something of the calmness and disengagedness of one whose soul has been wrenched by a mighty shock from all moorings here below. Hopes did not excite, fears did not alarm her. Life had no force strong enough to awaken a thrill within, and the only subjects on which she ever spoke with any degree of ardor were religious subjects. One who should have seen moving about the daily ministrations of the cottage a pale girl, whose steps were firm, whose eye was calm, whose hands were ever busy, would scarce imagine that through that silent heart were passing tides of thought that measured a universe. But it was even so. Through that one gap of sorrow flowed in the whole awful mystery of existence, and silently as she spun and sewed she thought over and over again all that she had ever been taught, and compared and revolved it by the light of a dawning inward revelation. Sorrow is the great birth agony of immortal powers. Sorrow is the great searcher and revealer of hearts, the great test of truth. For Plato has wisely said, sorrow will not endure sophisms. All shams and unrealities melt in the fire of that awful furnace. Sorrow reveals forces in ourselves we never dreamed of. The soul, a bound and sleeping prisoner, hears her knock on her cell door and wakens. Oh, how narrow the walls! Oh, how close and dark the grated window! How the long, useless wings beat against the impassable barriers! Where are we? What is this prison? What is beyond? Oh, for more air, more light! When will the door be opened? The soul seems to itself to widen and to deepen. It trembles at its own dreadful forces. It gathers up in waves that break with wailing, only to flow back into the everlasting void. The calmest and most centered natures are sometimes thrown by the shock of a great sorrow into a tumultuous amazement. All things are changed. The earth no longer seems solid, the skies no longer secure. A deep abyss seems underlying every joyous scene of life. The soul, struck with this awful inspiration, is a mournful Cassandra. She sees blood on every threshold, and shudders in the midst of mirth and festival with the weight of a terrible wisdom. Who shall dare be glad any more, that has once seen the frail foundations on which love and joy are built? Our brighter hours, have they only been weaving a network of agonizing remembrances for this day of bereavement? The heart is pierced with every past joy, with every hope of its ignorant prosperity. Behind every scale in music, the gayest and cheeriest, the grandest, the most triumphant, lies its dark relative minor. The notes are the same, but the change of a semitone changes all to gloom. All our gayest hours are tunes that have a modulation into these dreary keys ever possible. At any moment the key note may be struck. The firmest, best prepared natures are often beside themselves with astonishment and dismay when they are called to this dread initiation. They thought it a very happy world before, a glorious universe. Now it is darkened with the shadow of insoluble mysteries. Why this everlasting tramp of inevitable laws on quivering life? If the wheels must roll, why must the crushed be so living and sensitive? And yet sorrow is godlike, sorrow is grand and great, sorrow is wise and far-seeing. Our own instinctive valuations, the intense sympathy which we give to the tragedy which God has inwoven into the laws of nature, show us that it is with no slavish dread, no cowardly shrinking, that we should approach her divine mysteries. What are the natures that cannot suffer? Who values them? From the fat oyster over which the silver tide rises and falls without one pulse upon its fleshy ear, to the hero who stands with quivering nerve, parting with wife and child and home for country and God, all the way up is an ascending scale marked by increasing power to suffer. And when we look to the head of all being, up through principalities and powers and princedoms with dazzling orders and celestial blazonry, to behold by what emblem the infinite sovereign chooses to reveal himself, we behold in the midst of the throne a lamb, as it had been slain. Sorrow is divine, sorrow is reigning on the throne of the universe, and the crown of all crowns has been one of thorns. There have been many books that treat of the mystery of sorrow, but only one that bids us glory in tribulation, and count it all joy when we fall into divers afflictions, that so we may be associated with that great fellowship of suffering, of which the incarnate God is the head, and through which he is carrying a redemptive conflict to a glorious victory over evil. If we suffer with him, we shall also reign with him. Even in the very making up of our physical nature, God puts suggestions of such a result. Weeping may endure for a night, but joy cometh in the morning. There are victorious powers in our nature which are all the while working for us in our deepest pain. It is said that after the sufferings of the rack, there ensues a period in which the simple repose from torture produces a beatific trance. It is the reaction of nature, asserting the benignant intentions of her Creator. So, after great mental conflicts and agonies must come a reaction, and the divine spirit, co-working with our spirit, seizes the favourable moment, and interpenetrating natural laws with a celestial vitality, carries up the soul to joys beyond the ordinary possibilities of mortality. It is said that gardeners, sometimes when they would bring a rose to richer flowering, deprive it for a season of light and moisture. Silent and dark it stands, dropping one fading leaf after another, and seeming to go down patiently to death. But when every leaf is dropped, and the plant stands stripped to the uttermost, a new life is even then working in the buds, from which shall spring a tender foliage and a brighter wealth of flowers. So often in celestial gardening, every leaf of earthly joy must drop before a new and divine bloom visits the soul. End of section 27.